Okay, so now we're going to go through some of the institutions. Well, actually, you know what? I always start with the judiciary. There's no slide for the judiciary. That's right. There's no slide for the judiciary because it is under party control. You've got hundreds of thousands of prisoners without access to the legal system, a huge number of executions, a number which would make Texans jealous. We're talking about probably a couple thousand in the last year, but it's a secret, state secret, which would probably make Texans jealous as well. There's no room for a real constitutional court in a communist state because, of course, the vanguard of the proletariat takes care of all of that. So we dip straight into the legislature here. The legislature is the National People's Congress, not to be confused with the National Party Congress, which is a Communist Party institution. Although, of course, the National People's Congress is also an institution dominated really exclusively by the Communist Party, but it's not theoretically part of the party structures. So they've got a variety of commissions that handle day-to-day legislative needs. There are about 3,000 delegates. They have elections every 5 years. They only meet a couple weeks a year, but then they've got a standing committee that meets every couple months. The big thing to know about the National People's Congress is that it's really too big. It rarely meets. It has very little influence, although that may be, people have been saying that may be changing for like 10 years now. So that may be changing, but that's always a safe thing to say. So very weak legislature. It is a rubber stamp legislature. The executive is an interesting one. So the president is the head of the state. This is titular. In other words, it's just a title. But it's always held by the supreme leader, or also known as the paramount leader, or a designee of the supreme leader. So this can be the general secretary of the Communist Party, who has the power and the presidency, who doesn't have the power. But everyone would know then who actually has the power. They know that it was the general secretary. So the general secretary is not always the president, although of late the general secretary has been the president. The state council is more or less like a cabinet. It's headed by a premier who is recommended by the Central Committee and elected by the National People's Congress. The premier is usually a high-ranking member of the Politburo Standing Committee, so one of those 9. And what the premier does is the premier oversees ministries. There are about 50 of them. And the state council, actually, the entire state council, the entire cabinet oversees them. And they meet about twice a week. They develop economic plans, and most laws and regulations are actually developed within the state council. So this is important. It's not a legislative process where you go through the National People's Congress. Instead, the state council drafts all the laws, and then, bam, the National People's Congress hails them to whatever degree they need to. The real power is in the hands of what they call the supreme or paramount leader. And this generation, again, tends to combine Communist Party power with political office. So the general secretary normally means that someone's coming to power. So let me give you a couple of examples. Xi Jinping has been in charge and took the presidency just recently in early 2013. Hu Jintao was in charge, this is a good example. Hu Jintao became general secretary in 2002 and became president in 2003, but he's essentially ruled since 2002. He just ruled as president since 2003, but really the general secretaryship was when he took charge. Jiang Zemin, same thing, general secretary from 1989 to 2002. Not exactly the same thing. But Jiang Zemin actually becomes president in 1983, 6 years before he becomes general secretary. But then he doesn't really rule the country until 1992. So a few years after he becomes general secretary, then he rules the country as president. So more or less, general secretary and president have begun to coalesce. So I've just taken you backwards a few steps forward. Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping make it a lot more sensible. Previously, it was much less clear. Deng Xiaoping, for example, ruled from 1978 to 1992. but he was first vice premier part of that time, and then chair of the Central Military Commission for part of that. He was actually never Secretary General of the Communist Party. I think what really was his title was the central chair of the Central Military Commission, because lots of chairs of the Central Military Commission have also had this power. Who else? Well, I guess that's what you need to know. In other words, if you're looking for who's in power, look to the Communist Party more than to the institution. Although, again, the institutions and the Communist Party power structures have sort of coalesced, probably as a result of the international regime, which China's become increasingly a part of throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And the international regime necessitates some degree of transparency. People need to know who's in charge. But it's important to understand that having this paramount leader, or the supreme leader, really means that there is no rule of law. It's all about who says something is okay. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So rule of law does not exist in a place like China, as in most non-democracies. So you might expect Chinese civil society to be very strong, but then you'd be sadly mistaken, because I don't see any theoretical reason for that. That was horrible. So you would probably expect Chinese civil society to be quite weak, and I'm sure all of you probably did expect that, except that I didn't give you time to think about that. And there are lots of reasons for this. I mean, you can think about political culture. Again, we talked about this with respect to Japan. We're talking about a political culture, very traditional political culture, shaped in part by Confucianism. We're also talking about the nature of the party and the ideology. We've talked about this in the Soviet and Russian context, where civil society was thrown out. But then we are talking about a changing state. And so for those of you who, if you had paused this and thought about whether we expected strong or weak civil society, said strong civil society, you'd probably have good grounds to say that today, because civil society is certainly strengthening. With the rise of private companies over the last couple decades, probably 3 decades by now, this has been changing. And then with less and less Communist Party security. In other words, the social safety net has been drying up in China, something we'll talk about a little bit more in about 25 seconds. But it sparked lots of civil society activity. More sort of random strikes and protests, but very, very salient sort of signs that civil society is on the rise. So we've got the protests by peasants and workers. So let's talk about the political economy right now. Right. So here it is on your slide, the increased occurrence of protests thanks to economic grievances. So what you see is potentially the rise of civil society in China. And this would actually be a great research topic to figure out what changes political culture, whether economic conditions can be responsible for changes in political culture, where you have deferential political cultures and then economic circumstances push them to be less deferential. That would be sort of my hypothesis, but there's plenty of research to be going on in that sphere. So finally, with respect to the political economy, as I mentioned at the very beginning, here we talk about the Iron Rice Bowl. You've got very stable, historically, you've had very stable economic positions. There's this cradle-to-grave services. There's the Chinese economy has emphasized heavy industry a lot like the Soviet one did. All the economics have been controlled by the bureaucracy up until Deng. Now, once you had Deng, you had privatization of agriculture first, and he had what he called a household responsibility system, where you had to sell a certain amount of your produce to the state, and then not just produce, meat, everything, farm like stuff, and then the rest you could sell in the open market. So you had to meet your quota, and then after that you could sell for whatever you wanted. So you had the first market experiments in the early 1980s, late 1970s. Then industry became decentralized. The state sector plummeted in its control of the economy from about 80% of the industrial sector in 1980 to just 20% by 1996. to call China a communist party, or to call China a communist state is just well, it's just something that we do, but we only do it because the Communist Party, quote unquote, is in charge. But it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a communist state. It's actually gone in reverse. They've created special economic zones, again, back under Deng. It started in 1979 to encourage foreign investment. And, of course, today, and probably everything that for a lot of your lifetimes you've known as China is just this burgeoning economy. From 1998 to 2000, the gross national product quadrupled. Annually, it rises by usually 8 to 10%. Slow years are like 6.5%, 7.5%. But it still has a very low GDP. If you actually, per capita GDP is really what I mean to say. Now, in terms of trading partners, China is the U.S. China is the United States. Let me get this straight. So China is our second largest trading partner after Mexico, and we are for China the third largest trading partner. So we've got very strong relations. They need us, we need them. But going back to so we've got the decentralization of industry. So you've got this communist state that is no longer, in fact, communist. But you've got a communist party, calls itself a communist party, that wants to maintain control. All this has brought about these various social tensions. If you think about one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union, it was the fact that the system, a relative deprivation, the system set itself up. It claimed that it was providing more than it actually could, and so it angered people. Well, the same sort of things are going on right now. Reforms created unemployment. Of course, a lot of these people shouldn't have been employed in the first place, but in a communist system, they all should be employed. So how can you have unemployment when you're calling yourself a communist state? How can you have this huge rise in inequality when you're still calling yourself a communist state? A floating population of, again, 150 million people. A lack of access to services that were once free, like healthcare. Remember that 70% of people in China live in rural areas, which still face state-mandated low food prices in order to favor industrialization. Well, what does this mean? It means that people want to migrate to the cities. They migrate to the cities where they can actually earn more money, and then, of course, they face discrimination. There are pass laws, in other words, these residency permits that I talked about, and then broader discrimination. So you've got an increasingly free, though not yet entirely free market, especially since China entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. But you've got a lot of social displacement that's come with this. And the people who are best off, arguably, are the ones who are in the cities. And that's who the Chinese Communist Party elite have catered to, because they're the ones whose support they need for lots of theoretical reasons, right? And practical reasons. We know that that's where mobilization takes place. It's much easier to mobilize in the industrialized, in the urbanized areas, as we talked about, starting with the UK. And so, it makes good sense for them to take care of the people in the cities. The problem is that a majority of the population lives in the rural areas, and this could really spell disaster for China in the long run.